In our study of the life divine, Sri Aurobindo has been describing the stages through which evolution develops. And we saw in the first phase, it emerges out of some kind of a vital instinct based on vague feeling of the infinite and the invisible, and led by the vital instinct, it builds and develops its own forms. It develops relationships with powers which are invisible, tries to organize systems and methods by which this connection with the invisible worlds can grow. And nature has to begin with the material available at that point in evolution. Necessarily, at that stage, it is a crude and coarse formation, and yet it is a mix. He uses the word amalgam of primitive intuitions, occult rituals, religio-social ethics, mystical knowledge or experience symbolized in myth. But nature's goal was to push the human being to develop the intellect. And as she brings forward the intellect begins to dominate these other tendencies. And the intuitive, instinctive, and subliminal formations are overlaid by this intellectual process, force of reason and mental intelligence, creating their own superstructures. And the result is that in religion itself, there is a split that takes place where the religious forms remain and the occult component and mystical experience separate and follow their own separate trajectories. In the manner in which the intellect tries now to rationalize and explain things which earlier were felt and which reason cannot feel because reason does not have that vital instinct, necessarily many important elements of the religion are also pushed out, or they are discarded as merely superstitious. And you will recall the phrase Sri Aurobindo uses, that the complete denial of religion, occultism, and all that is supraphysical is the last outcome of this stage, a hard, dry paroxysm of the superficial intellect, hacking away at the sheltering structures that are refuges for the deeper parts of our nature. We have been through this phase in the global human evolution, and perhaps we can say 30 or 40 years ago, It was the most extreme. And somewhere in the late 60s, early 70s, there was as if this sudden opening to possibilities of a deeper subjective reality in many parts of the world. We cannot say all. But this phase was necessary, and in the subsequent description, which also we read last time, Sri Aurobindo shows how the intellect reaches its limit of capacity of physical discovery and finds that it can explain nothing. It has only touched the outer process of nature. There is still evidence that there are deeper processes which it cannot access. And so the intellect realizes that it needs to find some other means or some other method for a deeper access. And it once again turns to the domain of the occult to see if there is some truth in it. Now, here you will see the smooth transition from religion to occult knowledge. When the intellect has exhausted itself and religion has pretty much lost all of its deeper components, the intellect itself turns to the occult and attempts to bring back some of these elements, whether through religion or independent of religion, even through a scientific way. What was important in the portion we read last time, and this is the last sentence we read, religion itself has shown its power of survival and is undergoing an evolution, the final sense of which is still obscure. And here Sri Aurobindo is pointing to the new forms in which religion has to emerge. Some of these we can see in the attempts to create new religions. I have mentioned earlier the particular movement that named itself Scientology. And it is interesting that the name itself suggests a new direction. It is as if trying to harmonize the method and spirit of scientific inquiry with the truths which belonged earlier to the domain of religious experience. Another movement, which also is relatively recent, now more than 100 years, is Theosophy. Again, there, the attempt was, again, in the name, the form of the attempt is described. It seeks to discover God and study God, but through a rational origin. And in these, some of these, and there are others, in these we see the first signs of what the new direction or the new form of religion might be. In India, the form in which this transition has taken place, after a phase of rejection of religion, where people said, oh, this is all superstition and the mind dwelling on reason for the sake of reason, there was a very quick transition. It was not as hard as in the West. The quick transition took this form of inquiry. Why do we do these things? Why do we rotate the lamp clockwise and not clockwise and not anti-clockwise? Why do we do a namaste? Why do we and run the mala? Why 108? All of these questions show you that the intellect now wants to participate in what was earlier an infra-rational, vitalistic instinct by which one perceived the deeper things. And the intellect says, but I also want to experience this. I also want to. But how will the intellect experience? By understanding, by picturing, by visualizing. And a lot of the forms of the new religion have actually crept in through science. And people don't realize it immediately, but in a lot of the content of what passes through populist quantum science, quantum mechanics, we see elements of religion or Vedantic philosophy creeping in under the guise of reason and science, where they will say, well, there is an underlying unity in the whole universe, and therefore two particles at a distance can be connected. And this underlying unity, that's how reality is, that's how the world is. You have avoided the word God, you have avoided the terms associated with religion, but somehow you've brought in those concepts, and it is now scientific, it is acceptable. And you will see how almost every religion has turned to embrace these ideas, to include this vocabulary, non dualism, non localism, words which come from philosophy earlier, and even religious philosophy have come into science, and through science have now come into the new age religions. So the final sense of this, he says, is still obscure. We can't quite see what direction it will take, but the hints are there when we observe. In the wording, he, in the next sentence, in this new phase of the mind that we see beginning, remember this, he's writing this 100 years ago, but even today we see it's only beginning, much more wide, but still beginning. In this new phase of the mind that we see beginning, however crudely and hesitatingly, there can be detected the possibility of a pressure towards some decisive turn and advance of the spiritual evolution in nature. Now, this wording is something so extraordinary. When you look at how he states this, there's a new phase of mind. It was maybe very hesitating 100 years ago and crude. Today it is still crude, but no more hesitating. It has come into its own. It can now talk freely using these keywords of science. But what do we see there? There can be detected the possibility of a pressure towards some decisive turn. You're detecting a possibility. And what is the possibility of? A pressure of nature. Towards what? Towards some decisive turn. So we're still very far away. A decisive turn and advance of the spiritual evolution is going to take place. Nature is already pushing for it. But the push of nature is now seen as a possibility in this trend. In appearance. Of course, if you look more deeply, you can recognize it's already there and it's been building up for the last 200 or 300 years. But now, in the surface parts, in the surface turn of things, you can detect this. It's possible now that nature might actually make that leap. So, from 100 years to now, I will say we are able to detect today not merely a possibility, but even it seems to be a certainty. If you can look through the appearance, and the appearance seems to be a gigantic crisis, the sense of a great collapse, our economy, our environment, our political institutions, our human civilizational values, everything seems to be heading either for a giant collapse or a breakthrough of some kind, but it cannot sustain. And so we definitely see not a possibility, but a pressure towards something. And the pressure is building, it is intensifying in a way that things become more and more urgent. But what is the pressure towards? If we look with a deeper eye, we can see it is for a decisive turn and advance of the spiritual evolution. If you do not see with a deeper eye, then you say it is for change, for sustainability, for ecological awareness, for integration and harmonization with nature. And it stops there. But the deeper eye says, yes, but behind all this is the necessity of change of consciousness. And without that change of what we live for, we will not survive. Even if you speak of sustainability, what is the foundation of the sustainability? You have to shift your focus from desire and greed driven economies to an economy which is built on need. Because desire and greed have no end, need is limited. So, purely in terms of sustainability, you have to change consciousness. But is that all, or is there something deeper? And this is the key which will distinguish the successful breakthrough from another half baked semi success, which also we see people making an effort, it works for a time, it breaks down again. In the space of Auroville, Mother formulated that higher ideal so distinctly that there is no doubt. But in other such communities which have come up, either drawing on the inspiration of Auroville or just because that seems to be the urge in nature to form communities, there is often a shorter goal, and it may be purely economic, local currencies, local survival, local collaboration, which is good, but it goes only so far. At some point, it has to recognize there has to be a higher or deeper purpose for which we live. Otherwise, it will tend to stagnate or break down. So, in this, the other important idea which Sri Aurobindo is implying is that decisive turn and advance of the spiritual evolution in nature. The push for a decisive turn and advance by who? By nature. And we are able to detect that. And the suggestion here is that it's not we who decide. It is nature who is deciding. Nature is pushing us. That's why this is happening. And that's why it's inevitable once she has decided to do it. So the picture now we step back, is this fumbling, bumbling human consciousness having pushed to the level of intellectual development by who? By nature, and having lost certain elements of the religious truths because of the push to intellect, nature still preserves those truths in a few individuals because she wants to reunify them on a higher level later. Again, nature is doing everything. And at the same time, there is, from a spiritual perspective, the call of the divine presence, which leans from above to assist in our awakening. So, what we experience is a push of nature from below and the pull from above of the divine. And it is the combination of these two meeting which makes for this decisive turn and advance of the spiritual evolution. If there was not the help from above, nature's push alone is insufficient to make that transition. That is why the avatar comes. That is why there is a spiritual descent that takes place to assist in this transition at this point, which is, without a doubt, the most crucial in human evolution. Precisely because the intellect now is so powerful that it can destroy everything on just one foolish move, whether it is through atom bombs, which was the more obvious form earlier, or now a more insidious and less obvious form through genetic interventions. We can push out a genetically modified disease for which nothing can resist, or a genetic modification that suddenly destroys the fertility of life in plants and in animals. And all of this is happening. So, at this point, which is most crucial, and the intellect has no solution and has removed the deeper values of which religion had brought, you have this assistance from above, from the spirit, and the push of nature, and the two joining. For us individually, these two meetings take place in us. The push of nature is this thing within which, in every child and in every adult, makes us feel somehow dissatisfied, restless with the way things are. This is not how it's supposed to be. There is something deeper, something more meaningful, which should be there, which I can't find. That's the push of nature from within. If within this we have had also spiritual sensitivity, then we feel also the call of the spirit that says, yes, there is this, and I must reach this. I must fill my life more and more with this, which gives me the joy and the satisfaction which nothing else can give. And then in between these two are those more vitalistic or mentalistic satisfactions, which momentarily satisfy, and then we say, now what? Been there, done that, now what? And you want to go further. But in this one sentence, there's a lot of rich suggestion and insight. And now he concludes with what religion has done and what the intellect has done in this transition. He says, religion, rich but with a certain obscurity in her first infra-rational stage, had tended under the overweight of the intellect to pass into a clear but bare interspace. But it must, in the end, follow the upward curve of the human mind and rise more fully at its summits. And the rest of the sentence. So, in this transition, religion had entered this interspace. Interspace is the space in between. So there was a religious phase which was infrarational. There will be a new form of this religious experience, which will be, let's say, suprarational. And this in between a rational phase is an interspace because it has literally destroyed the content of religion itself, as if. And so he says, religion rich. A lot of rich content exists. If you look at the more traditional forms of religion in Europe, in the Catholicism as distinct from the Protestantism, you see a richness of a whole tradition and experience and teaching and practices which mostly have been cleaned out in the Protestant forms. Or even if you go to the earlier traditions which did not go through this struggle in the more orthodox churches, incredible richness of practices and rituals and beliefs. I remember I was the first time when I visited Europe, it was in Cyprus. I had met with a spiritual community, and it was one of the very few that I knew of in Europe which actually took a spiritual form, although rooting itself in the vocabulary of Christianity. And it was very yogic in its teaching, and the leader was an exceptional being. I was with them for a few days, and then as I was leaving, the one of the women who was part of this group said that I'm arranging for my husband to drive you to the airport, but be careful, he does not have any interest in these things. So I said, fine. As I'm driving with the husband, on his own, he suddenly said, you know, I don't believe in all this. So I kept quiet for a while. And then I asked him, what is it that you don't believe in? The first point was his reaction, which said, I don't believe in all this. The moment he's asked, what is it I don't believe in? He started thinking, and he had not thought about what he didn't believe in. So after a while, he's thought, and then he says, he's found his easy answer. I don't believe in whatever my wife believes in. Simple negation. And I waited, and he went on thinking. And after a while on his own, he said, you know, I can't believe that God would want us to do all this ritualism. And that was it. That's all that was needed. He had the intuitive sense of the divine reality, presence, God. He was reacting against the Greek Orthodox Church and its very complicated rituals and practices. I can't believe that God would want us to do all this, because the problem of the church teaching was, if you don't do all this, you will go to hell. And God is going to punish you. Then that something didn't fit. So, of course, in his case, I said simply, you know, but your wife also doesn't believe in that. She has a very different belief. But I saw that in many such who seem to reject, there is some intuitive sense, but now having rejected the forms and the focus being on the rejection, there was not sufficient pursuit to find out what will be my form of relationship with the divine. So this problem of richness led to a surfeit of richness, but also it was all infra-rational. So religion, rich but with a certain obscurity in her first infra-rational stage. The problem is, because it emerged in that vital instinct and not a reasoning mind, it had a lot of the obscurity, the darkness. We don't know why, but that's how it is. And even the intellect has a certain light that says, but it doesn't make sense. So religion had tended, under the overweight of the intellect, to pass into a clear but bare rational interspace. So, clear but bare rational interspace, and religion has tended to pass, not entirely, but this is the tendency. And what's the difference between clear but bare? If to pause on each word, clarity is, of course, under the influence of the intellect. All the things which don't make sense, which are not rational, have been removed. So it has been cleared from a lot of unnecessary or even false formulation, from a lot of superstitious content, and sometimes with it a lot of truths also lost. But as a result, it has been made clear. But in that clarity is also a bareness, finer, subtler variations of the truths, the richness of the opening to the divine and the play of the divine in life. All that has been knocked out, and a kind of an evenness, a flattening has been made. In Europe, you will see how the first phase of Christianity spreading, there was an element of the Christian mysticism. But in the second phase, the mysticism was replaced by the politics of the church, which led to what they call the Dark Ages. And in that period, you will find all of the subtler and particularly occult knowledge, which was more traditionally spread out, was eliminated. As I've mentioned before, several million people burnt at the stake as witches because they knew how to heal illnesses with herbs. They had access to nature's spirits or practices which gave them power over natural processes and so on. A lot of rich knowledge was also exterminated by this spread of the church influence. And there are people who look back at that phase and say, what a great loss. And we might agree that a lot of worthwhile knowledge was lost. But as I always remind myself, that the knowledge was never brought by people questing for it. It was brought by people who were open to the intuition, whether vital intuition or a higher intuition. So ultimately nothing is lost. One can always draw back whatever is relevant for the future. But something more important took place for which the loss of that rich knowledge was worthwhile. And that was the cleaning out of all the intermediate connecting points of religion, where the focus was on a kind of a very superficial attraction to powers in nature and stopping short there, not going further to the deeper spiritual. That needed to be cleaned out because it had become a barrier to spirituality. And what do we mean by spirituality? That realm from which the underlying oneness is experienced. Anything short of that, we will not call spiritual. We can call occult, we can say generally mystical, but it does not become spiritual until you have touched the underlying oneness. So, in the vital, inner vital, in the mental or the inner mental, even in ranges of the higher mental, you may still be stuck in a fragmented and divided experience of the inner things. And at some point, if that becomes all, that becomes sufficient in itself, it needs to be cleaned out. And what the Catholic teaching did was to insist on one God and one intermediary to God, whether it was Christ or church or a combination of both, that focusing on one and one transcendence, that cut through all these intermediate layers. In the process, of course, religion itself became an oppression, and the church lost its own spiritual right to lead people, and which led to other forms of crisis. But that sense of the focus on the one was necessary. And having brought that clarity, unfortunately now bare, because there is only one pointed focus and the rich diversity is gone, it's a rational interspace in between. But what happens next? But it meaning religion, but it must in the end follow the upward curve of the human mind and rise more fully at its summits. Because reason itself emerged because it was a necessity of the evolution. From the vitalistic instinct to reason, but mind will not stop there. It must continue its curve, and as it turns to higher things, rise more fully at its summits towards its true or greatest field in the sphere of a supra rational consciousness and knowledge. And so the turn of religion as it rises in this way, if it survives the in between transition, is towards the supra rational, where it began in the infra rational, passed through the purifying passage or barren passage of the intellect, it opens to the supra rational consciousness and knowledge, and that is its true and its greatest field. What will such a religion be like? Because already the very character of the supra-rational is that it lives on the basis of experience. And if it does not experience, then it will say, well, this has no value. And yet that experience is not irrational. It is supra-rational. It includes the ability to articulate itself in rational terms. And this is the direction we see today. All of the, to use a crude phrase, mumbo jumbo associated with religion, the mechanical, mindless ritualism tends to fade out unless it can give you some touch of experience. Or there is a clear turn towards a mystical dimension of the religion, which now becomes the new form and the new direction. I remember meeting during my travels with somebody who was an evangelical leader. He said he had a couple of million followers among the evangelists. And I tried to understand what was this evangelical teaching. And his movement was called the New Evangelical teaching. So what was new about it and what is evangelical? And he explained that as evangelists, we believe literally in the word of the Bible. Whatever the Bible says, we take it as God's word with no questioning, no doubt, and in the way it is stated, not as the way somebody else interprets. You see, already an attempt to go to something which is a pure experience. But since the framework is a text, well, you go to the pure text. Except the Bible itself is translation of the Hebrew, which is translation of something else. So, well, that's the closest you could get. But the other component, which was the most interesting element, is that the young people who were turning to this new evangelical movement were turning on the basis of some real living relationship with God or with Christ. And it was interesting to see in his behavior and in others associated with him this special focus on feeling that relationship and living in that, or somehow incorporating that relationship in everything in life. And this is the beginning of the mystical revival or the deeper spiritual content. And we see similar things in all other religions. If you don't have it, well, they don't survive. They just fade away. So with this, Sri Aurobindo completes the phase of this transition where the intellect came and asserted itself and caused a passage towards, or prepared for a passage towards, the supranational. Having said this, he turns the gaze back to the past. Where is the evidence? Because in the Life Divine, Sri Aurobindo has to answer to all the rational questioning and the current beliefs, also whether they are right or wrong. He has to either justify or show where they fall short. So now in the next paragraph, in the next two paragraphs, in fact, he discusses what is the evidence, and particularly the part of the evidence which is too far in the past for us to validate. Most of the examples we have given have to do with the last few thousand years. What was before, though? So he says, if we look at the past, we can still see the evidences of this line of natural evolution, although most of its earlier stages are hidden from us in the unwritten pages of prehistory, the phase of which the record of history does not survive, because, well, it was not written. Whatever is written, even at least in India, can go back at least 5,000 to 7,000 years. In Europe, less because of the passage of destruction in between. But even that is not prehistory. Prehistory is the stage before that. And the character of that prehistorical stage is the intellect had not come into its own in a strong way. And that means we can go back even 500,000 or more years. Many things have happened there. There have even been large cycles of evolution where things rose and then fell and rose again and fell and even touched the intellect, not once, but perhaps a couple of times. So he's now looking at that prehistoric phase. And there are theories about what happened then. He says, it has been contended that religion in its beginnings was nothing but a mass of animism, fetishism, magic, totemism, taboo, myth, superstitious symbol, with the medicine man as priest, a mental fungus of primitive human ignorance. Later on, at its best, a form of nature worship. It has been contended. That's what people have said. Even the church today will say that's what it was before Christianity came and brought in the real knowledge. So it's easy to dismiss all that under these terms. And he says it could have been so, but then he suggests something else also might have been. But in this, what is it that it has been contended? There's a whole list of words: animism, fetishism, magic, totemism, taboo, myth, superstitious symbol, and mental fungus of primitive human ignorance. And if he bothers to give you a list of words like that, we have to pause and look at each of those. Why did he mention them? You see, all these words are associated with primitive cultures, tribal, crude forms of religions. And so the first he says, mass of all these things. So what are these things? Animism. And animism is the idea that within every object is a power. We'll say even an occult power, some form of consciousness or being which can act and exercise itself. So animism looks at all objects in nature and says, here there is some power, here there is some power, and we must say our thanks to this power, we must draw help from that power. And everywhere you look, there are only these different powers. And then sometimes they collide. Or sometimes you have to say, all right, I must appease this power, but that power is greater, so I must also appease that one. Which one comes first? Okay, I'll start with the bigger fellow. He is more dangerous. He gets upset easily. It becomes such a mess. Large number of powers to please or to look after, and it can become unending. That's one form in which we see some of the primitive religious expressions. Second is fetishism, where the concept is that a particular object now has the ability to act on something else as an occult power. So fetishism might say that here is a special magical stick, and whenever the medicine man picks up the stick, such and such a thing can happen. And the object is given as if the authority or the power. And again, around this, a lot of things can be built up. You will find, for example, in certain parts of Northeast Africa, which is the country in which
Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt, Libya.
there is a whole fetishism around the Ark of the Covenant, where Queen of Sheba came from. No, Queen of Sheba? Okay. Ethiopia, that's right. In Ethiopia. Okay. In Ethiopia, everywhere you go, there will be rituals around the Ark of Covenant, which is this magical device which is mentioned in the Bible. Each center which has this will claim this is the original one, except you don't know which is the original one. Of course, you would suspect the original one, if it was there, would not be brought out into public. There are even spaces which are demarcated, at the center of which is a room in which this ark is kept. And there will be a person assigned to look after it because it's a religious object. It has a tremendous power. And the person assigned to look after it has to remain very pure, follow a very strict life. He is not allowed to step out from the boundary of this sacred space. And there are people who dedicate their lives to servicing this sacred object. And you can pause and ask, for what? And somehow that's forgotten. It's a sacred object which has to be protected. It is somehow a gift from God with which you can commune with God, or God can send his powers to act on earth. And that is good enough for you to dedicate your life to looking after it. And perhaps just the fact that somebody spends such an effort in worshipping or caring for it may even give to it a certain living experience and force. It's full of them, and that would be an example of a fetishism where the focus is on an object of power, which now becomes an end in itself. Or magic. And magic here is used in a more crude form where an incantation or a spell can have the ability to somehow change things or control powers of nature. Fourth, he mentions is totemism. And a totem is a more complex form. There's a sequence you will see to all these. They grow to higher and higher gradations. Totemism is where an entire group, a collective, holds an object or an animal as a symbol of its identity. So let's say this particular animal is the totem of our tribe, and so we respect the animal and we look after it, and the totem has then to pass on when this animal dies to another. Or if it's an object, then the object represents the well-being of the community, and if the object is damaged, then community will lose its identity or will not survive. And somehow as the community grows, the object gets some element added to it. So the totem keeps growing with new elements added. But the idea still is that you are representing something outside of you as yourself, but in a collective. And the next word he has is taboo. Taboo is something which is forbidden because it's dangerous, because it's bad, it's wrong. In the Middle Eastern tradition, they have this word haram, something which is forbidden, and if you do it, then you will be cursed by God, you will get bad luck, you will lose all your wealth, or you will die, or whatever it is, the belief associated. But the idea is that certain things have a negative power, because of which you should not do. Now, if you see this whole description in the whole series, there's a do's and a don'ts, things which give you strength, which give you virility, which protect you, and then things which negate. And that causes as if a narrowing of human behavior, regulates desires, regulates our code of ethics, and can be helpful at an early stage of social development. But after that comes something still higher, myth. And the character of myth is a higher truth is represented in a symbolic story, which you can easily narrate, and you feel a resonance of the higher reality behind. So already in the myth, there is an upward turn and a breaking out from the more material parts. So you see, animism, the object itself, has, or all objects have some power. Fetishism, the power is narrowed now in a single object. Magic, now it is disengaged from the object and can be invoked by incantation. And then totemism, it acquires a collective character. In a taboo, there is a negation or a restriction. These are the boundaries, don't cross that. And in myth, you're turning to a higher truth of which you are accessing a symbol. And above that, superstitious symbol, which straight away opens to the recognition that you're only handling a symbol, with the medicine man as priest. And then he says, of course, the medicine man is the person who is there to heal people. So the healer also now talks to the higher realm. Now, all of this, remember, is what it has been contended. That is what comes from the more conventional bottom-up view, materialistic viewpoint of human evolution. And so this is what you'll be taught in all the textbooks on religion. That since the fellow the medicine man had the power to heal. He becomes now the intermediary for higher, of course, someone's imagination. So he's showing you this, but then he will show you that actually this might be a degradation of a higher knowledge. And then he says a mental fungus or of primitive human ignorance, that religion itself is believed to be by them a mental fungus of primitive human ignorance. And we have to pause and wonder at this phrasing. Why fungus? What is special about fungus? Do you know what defines fungus and separates it from plant? It lacks chlorophyll. Plants have chlorophyll by which they convert light into nutrition. Fungus does not have chlorophyll and therefore it grows in darkness. But if you expose it to light, what happens? It dies very quickly. Interesting. So something that grows rests upon a rotten material, needs darkness and humidity, and lacking the ability to absorb and assimilate light. And exposed to light, it dies very quickly. So you see how precisely he picks these terms. Religion itself is seen as a mental fungus of primitive human ignorance. And the moment you expose it to light, well, all that would break up away. At least that's the belief, because there's nothing to it. And it feeds on this darkness, it feeds on ignorance, it feeds on this moisture in which things rot. It does not like fresh air, it does not like change of energy. It must stay stagnant in order to be able to grow. That's the character of fungus. Or as has been said, and Sri Aurobindo doesn't seem to quote this because I think it was not so popularly known at the time, in the Marxist ideology, religion is the drug of the masses. So when masses suffer too much, they take the drug to numb their suffering, and religion only serves as a drug. But these are all contentions. And so he says, later on, at best, a form of nature worship. From these, you can see how nature worship could emerge, perhaps. Or, as he will suggest later, how these are degradations from the perception of a deeper truth seen through nature, which could also happen equally. Each of these terms he has described could be seen as a fall from a higher perception. So he says, now Sri Aurobindo comments, it could well have been so in the primitive mind, though we have to add the proviso that behind much of its beliefs and practices, there may have been a truth of an inferior but very effective kind that we have lost with our superior development. So perhaps to the primitive mind, this is how it was, religion. But seen from a higher standpoint, we can recognize behind these there were truths, which with our development we have lost, but which to the primitive mind would have been natural. You will see, for example, a dog suddenly gets up in a closed room, suddenly gets up and stares intently at a wall. And you wonder what it is. You try to listen, you can't hear, but maybe he's hearing something. And then he'll stare at the wall and start barking for no reason. To us, with our superior development, he is foolish, irrational, religious, maybe, yes, with some taboo or fetishism or animism. But there's a very interesting incident I had read of when somebody was having an out-of-body experience. And he was in the subtle body. He was wandering around, going from places, exploring the world through the subtle body. And he goes to someone's house and finds the person sitting, working, or resting. And immediately as he enters, because his subtle body goes through the walls, immediately as he enters, the dog who's lying down looks up and stares at him. And so he looks at the dog, and the dog looks at him and starts barking. And to the person who was in the room, there was no reason why the dog was staring at the wall and barking. To the person in the subtle body, it was obvious the dog was sensing him and responding to him and saying, "How did you come through? You're not supposed to be here." So they have a subtler perception. And in primitive humanity, which would have been much closer to that level of sensitivity which is normal to animals, there would have been all these, and far more sensitive than we are today. As you can see, even today, if you go to certain tribal cultures of the world, people still have sensitivities of the animals. Like a dog, they can smell an object and pursue it to its source. We who have been civilized have lost that sensitivity. They are not yet civilized, but they have access to many other sensitivities equally. So there may be a truth of an inferior but very effective kind. And the importance here is on the effectivity. It worked for them. That's why it stayed. If it didn't work for them, it would not have stayed. Innate to the human curiosity and the human instinct of progress, nothing will survive if it does not correspond to an actual experience. Then he says, primitive man lives much in a low and small province of his life being. And this corresponds on the occult plane to an invisible nature which is of a like character, and whose occult powers can be called into activity by a knowledge and methods to which the lower vital intuitions and instincts may open a door of access. Now comes the larger understanding of what this actually represents. And for this, we step back to the general perspective of evolution that Sri Aurobindo offers. That first of all, there are, in the descending movement, planes of consciousness. From top down, there is an involution of increasingly restricted and limited gradations of consciousness, all the way down to matter. And in the evolution, at each step of the emergence, structures of life forms are formed corresponding to these planes, which are organized level by level, on an occult level. What is important, which Sri Aurobindo explains, is as the evolution pushes upward, things of that plane to which they correspond also reach out and assist the upward pull. So when the animal turns to mind or yearns to think, the things from the mental world lean and connect and assist that thought formation. Or as the human turns towards the spiritual, things of the spiritual domain also lean to pull and draw us. But when we live at the current level, we are linking in with the mental world corresponding to our grade of mind. And that is very varied in humanity. So there are lower ranges of mind and higher ranges of mind, and each one lives according to things of that world and is open to suggestions on that level of mind. So let's say for those who live much more in the realm of desire mind, there is a whole clutter of desire impulses or desire impulsed thought which belong to that domain, which will keep seizing them because that's what they live in. Someone who has shifted a little bit towards a more reasoned mind and not so desire and instinct based will open out to reasoned thoughts, rational thoughts, and so on. And to him, these lower gradations of impulses won't touch. Sitting in the same space, somebody will catch the series of attractive pulls, the other person will be thinking of higher things. So as you know, what happens when people sit in a sacred space, you're sitting for meditation. It happens to everybody. That's when your thoughts start working the maximum, because suddenly you have nothing to do. What are the thoughts that come to you? Observe them. And that gives you a clue of what are the ranges that you're most open to. And of course, in a group, these thoughts resonate across people also. What they don't realize is often there's a thought that spreads and it hits a whole group of people and passes. There are many jokes around this. There's the joke of the priest who, while he's in a church, is thinking of his wife. And when he's with his wife, then he's thinking of the church. And that's the nature of the mind, but it shows you the level at which you live. But if this is true of us as we are today, you go down a couple of steps to the level of primitive man. What is the character there? He lives much in a low and small province of his life being. Not entirely, but the bulk of him is in low and small province of life being. That is what Sri Aurobindo has described in Savitri as the kingdoms of the little life, where everything is concentrated on small interests, small goals, small results, small desires, small drives, and of a low grade. In the human physiology, the chest maps to the higher movement of the vital, the center, which is called the plexus, maps to the general vital in itself, and the region around the navel is the lower vital, where all the small instincts and desires are rooted. That's where also we find our passions are rooted, in the abdomen that the passion is felt, whereas the turn of the heart towards selflessness is in the upper part of the chest. So it is on that level, that grade of consciousness, that he is primarily living. And then he says that this corresponds on the occult invisible nature, which is of a like character. So what is the character? Low and small province of lying. Now, if you enter a forest and begin to explore nature, you will find the trees out towards the sun, opening wide, and then bearing down with it fruits, sharing with all. And there's this movement of the higher vital. You'll find plants and shrubs which are as if closed in themselves. There is no opening out. The form often expresses the movement of life. And so it's difficult to, it's as if they won't give easily. And then still smaller, and corresponding to each of these, and you can see, of course, in the moss, the special feature as you go down to that level in the moss is you cannot distinguish one plant from the other. They don't have individuality, they have only a collective consciousness. As separate from that, a plant that comes where you can see the stem and the individuality is quite clear. Not so developed, but at least it begins. The grass would be an intermediate. You can see each grass plant, but the whole is the collective consciousness. Corresponding to each of these levels of life force, there are beings which are working there. And then there are beings who work to assist these plants. With each of these gradations, the beings also function of the same grade of consciousness. So let's say you are looking at the level of the grass, and there's a whole cluster of beings, it's more like not individualized, it's a mass of flowing energy. And that mass you can see in the grass leans towards a particular patch and says, here, I want to go here. And the grass starts growing. And within a few weeks, it has grown in that direction. So the life being associated with that patch of grass is the one who's leading the physical development. Similar thing happens at the level of plants, where each plant now may have a certain quality and a being presiding over it or representing and expressing it. And then there are beings who are generally required to look after things. So they create microclimates. They create patches in the garden where moisture is kept high so that a certain plant which is growing may get the nutrition that it wants. They will coordinate with higher trees so that there is a covering that comes to protect the small plant from the sun and so on. Often they're seen as gnomes or elves. But they are life spirits, not strongly individualized, but sufficiently individualized that you can see them. But they can also dissolve easily into more collective gnome consciousness. There was the example which my teacher MP Pandit's sister had this experience. For a long time, for many years, she would find that there was a little being which would come to her. It was very friendly and nice, like a little dwarf-like being, which would come and be nice to her, and it would say, oh, so-and-so is going to come. And at first she didn't pay attention, and then within a few minutes the person would come. Or sometimes it would warn her that you have left behind the food which is cooking and it's going to overflow. Go and take a look at it. So she used to have this interesting conversation, and sometimes she would ask it for help. She would say, all right, I've lost this thing. Can you help me find it? And she named him. She said Chotappa, which would be translated as, because from the Kannada background, it was like a little one. And then when she used to go to the mother, this little dwarf would go with her. But when she was about to enter the mother's room, it stopped. It refused to go further. So when the mother was asked about it, mother said, yes, naturally. If it comes inside, then it will be dissolved. Interesting. The spiritual presence in the room, of course, is so strong, so intense, that the smaller beings would lose their separateness and just dissolve. And it sensed it and it stopped. But this is to share with you that there is a whole domain of life beings corresponding to that grade of consciousness. And we have, of course, spoken of the positive ones. There are equally forces which have a, to us, negative character corresponding to the vibration, let's say, of anger or hatred or jealousy. And there will be beings associated with that. In their functioning in nature, they don't have such a negative sense. They are just doing their job. They can only do what they are as if made to do, or the consciousness that they represent spontaneously. You will remember the incident Mother narrates of stones which were thrown in the ashram guest house at that time when Sri Aurobindo was there. Someone had done a black magic and stones were falling. So when Sri Aurobindo was informed and Mother erased those symbols, the whole thing stopped. Then Mother said, I was curious to see what's behind this. So she summoned the beings. When she narrates it, it's so casual. She summoned the beings. All she had to do was, in her universal consciousness, she said, okay, where are you? Who's this? And they're forced to come. They don't have a choice. So they appeared before her, and she said there were three little beings, very jolly and laughing. And they didn't have any sense of right or wrong. You see, at that level of consciousness, you live by the instinctive drive. No right or wrong. That comes with the mind. Mind says, oh, but this is harming others. This is not good or bad. So they were there, and Mother says, well, why are you doing this? They said, we were asked to do it. We didn't have a choice. The black magician basically forced them to. So she said, all right, why don't you do something for me? She said, yes, surely, tell us what to do. She asked, can you bring me flowers? And they look at each other and say, sorry, we can't do that. So Mother asks, what can you do? We can only throw stones. But they corresponded to a particular function in nature which involved this relationship with stones. And so that's all that they could do, materializing stones. Now think about how important this is. If you were in a desert space, if you were in a forest even, and there is a necessity for certain climatic conditions for plants to be able to bloom, and human beings are not there to assist. Animals can only do so much. Well, you can nudge the instinct of an animal or a bird to go and lift something and drop something, which also nature does, by the way. A bird nibbles a fruit here, flies 100 kilometers and sheds the seed. Well, that was nature's way of spreading. But you need stones. Who's going to bring stones? It doesn't correspond to instincts within animals easily. And there are these beings which can say, all right, I'm going to pick up the stone which is there and bring it here. And that's what they do. And so there is a power, or there is a functioning of nature with many of these powers operating at that very low level. And many things are done. They can control humidity, they can control all kinds of life processes, even bacteria. And wherever necessary, they will increase the microbiome of the soil. They can control the worms, they can control snakes, and many other functions. They can sprout seeds. They can also, by the way, some of them are associated with water welling up from the ground. So where water is needed, they will work from inside to create a flow of water to make it rise and come up sufficiently that there is nourishment for the plants. It's very interesting as an observation. At the top of almost any mountain, you will find streams of clear water. Now we would assume this would come from the rains at the top of the mountain, percolating through the top and then becoming streams. But the rains are once a year, the streams are perennial. How do you explain this? And they come up from below. There's a very interesting work done by somebody called Victor Schauberger, and what he discovered was wherever the water bubbled up, it was in shade. And the temperature in the water region was a steady, I believe, 22 or 24 degrees, I don't remember. The moment he removed the tree shade, the water stopped coming up and the stream dried up. He put it back and the water began to come. And what it showed was there was some process below the ground through which water was pushed up. But it was dependent on circumstances up there. It seems almost like anti-gravity when you think about it. It's being pushed up, but if you make the right temperature and circumstances. So he developed a whole science around this. But I'm sharing this because the forces involved which make for this water flow and so on are these little beings. Now, if you live on that level, obviously you resonate easily with those beings. This corresponds on the occult plane to an invisible nature which is of like character, that is, low and small province of life, and whose occult powers can be called into activity by a knowledge and methods to which the lower vital intuitions and instincts may open a door of access. So the insight here we have is corresponding to every level of consciousness, corresponding to every plane of consciousness. Not only there are powers and beings, but to each plane there is a knowledge and methods by which they can be entered in relation with. So to a consciousness which lives on that level, the instincts or intuitions would give you access. So at this lower vital level, if you are living, your lower vital instincts, the gateway at least to access that knowledge and those methods. So the person goes there, he finds that the plants are not growing, or there is a lack, the stream has dried up, and instinctively he may feel that the water is inside. If only I could reach in and call it out. Instinctively, he then reaches out, does a prayer, or does a call, or does something which to him will be as if a call by making an offering of that which would please the water deities, and so on. So if they follow their vital intuitions, the instinct may open the door of access and even lead to the development of such methods. So this might be formulated in a first stage of religious belief and practice, which would be a cult after a crude, inchoate fashion in its character and interests, not yet spiritual. So you can see here the first stages of religious belief and practice. Primary focus is still occult. There's nothing of the spiritual which has appeared here. And its main element would be a calling in of small life powers and elemental beings to the aid of small life desires and crude physical welfare. Small life powers and elemental beings. Why are they called elemental beings? As distinct from life powers which we described. Elemental beings because they correspond to elements. And the elements and their working in nature, of course, earth, water, fire, air, and so on, and maybe other things which you could also call elements. There are beings which preside over these. At a low level, you can access them easily. And so a magician could use an incantation to light a fire. Otherwise, life would be very difficult for them, isn't it? And in a primitive tribe where someone has the ability to call the fire being and trigger a fire at will would be very highly respected. And you could see how this could become the center of certain religious forms and beliefs. Or you call for rains. You've planted your crops in time according to the position of the sun. Remember, you don't have a physical clock and calendar. So you have to monitor carefully. Now the sun has reached the maximum of the south. It has reversed. The days are becoming longer. And from there you count the lunar cycles. 3 moons have passed since the sun turned. We are ready to plant. And that's when normally the rains should come, except they didn't. What do? Well, call the rains, propitiate those forces, or find means to access, which again at that level, which our developed mind doesn't have access to, at that level you can sense the way animals sense that the rains are going to come. When we were small, we were told here that when dragonflies suddenly appear, you know that it's going to rain. And we watched for many years. It used to be very precise. The dragonflies came, and that evening there would be rain. How did they know? That's the life instinct, which the human at that level will access. And so Sri Aurobindo has justified the earlier idea that a lot of religion could have been that mass of animism, fetishism, etc., with medicine man as priest. But yes, it could have formed in this way. It corresponds to a certain truth, but this is not all. He gives us now this other insight. But this primitive stage, if it is indeed such, and not what we still see of it, a fall or a vestige, a relapse from a higher knowledge belonging to a previous cycle of civilization, or the debased remnants of a dead or obsolete culture. Then he continues the sentence, this primitive stage can have been only a beginning. That's the sentence. And in between is this parenthetical statement. So the primitive stage can only be a beginning. We have accepted that. It is followed after whatever stages by the more advanced types of religion, of which we have a record in the literature or surviving documents of the early civilized peoples. This much accepted, now we go to what is this parenthetical statement? And it is extremely important to understand certain things of today. He says, if indeed it is such, if indeed it is a primitive stage, and he's suggesting very strongly that it is not so. What is it likely then? It is not so in what we still see of it. Yes, there would have been such a stage, but it was many thousands or many million years ago. What we see of it today, if you go to certain parts of tribal culture in the world, he says it's not necessarily that. He says, if it is indeed such and not a fall or a vestige, a relapse from a higher knowledge belonging to a previous cycle of civilization. So there was a previous cycle of civilization which had developed a higher knowledge, and from that higher knowledge there has been a fall. Or of that higher knowledge, when the higher content is lost, only the core ritual or external form of it remains as a vestige, which has lost the contact with the higher knowledge. Or a relapse. Having had access to a higher knowledge, when the consciousness once again fell, you applied that knowledge now to a lower object, and so got lost in the lower axis. And I'm going to give a few examples of several of these because it's important to understand. I have shared before how in many of the tantric traditions in India, there is almost an exclusive focus on powers of nature and control over these powers, lower or higher. The lower ones, of course, demand much more in return. The higher ones demand from you at least a purity and exclusive obedience to their higher value. But a lot of this represents actually a fall. Elsewhere, Sri Aurobindo explains the problem of the tantric approach, because the tantra is essentially a form of spiritual practice that turns to the Divine Mother, the Shakti to whom you surrender yourself. And as you surrender to her, she reveals more and more of her working. And from her higher working, you begin to perceive her lower working also. And so you begin to perceive her working in nature. And then naturally, you begin to associate with certain functions and knowledge of specialized workings in nature. And at that point, the whole body of knowledge tends now to focus only on this, losing the higher spiritual character, losing the higher working of the divine Shakti, which is free, and instead focusing on the energy of nature, which is bound, which is lower nature. and then powers within lower nature and her functions. And so a lot of the literature, as I said, is focused on these things. And again, as I described, as happened in Europe, there was a clean out that took place with the church teaching of such access. Something similar took place in India. A lot of texts, a lot of lineages who held the knowledge of these particularities, including even methods to cure incurable illnesses, they were all lost. My grandfather had specific knowledge of a particular medicine which had to be made using a combination of herbs and mantras. And it had to be made with that combination, and it could cure any form of ringworm. And miraculously, overnight, the ringworm would be gone. Similarly, there were other methods given which could reverse the poisoning by snake. So if you have a snake bite, the poison has already spread in your bloodstream. It's now eating away at your nervous system and your brain. And then this person comes who focuses on the point where the poison has entered, puts a stone on it, and for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, after a while, the stone begins to become black, and the patient begins to wake up from his coma. And the stone has become so black that now the medicine man will say, the stone has absorbed the poison from the body, and the person is now cured. If you think of it in medical terms, it is impossible. There's nothing in the blood flow that can reverse and separate out the poison and make it come out into a stone. So there are obviously some occult elements involved. They had a means to prepare the stone. I believe they could reuse the stone. They had to do something to eject the poison. And they had to have a special relationship with the snakes. Interesting. And to them, the snakes would not bite, or they could command the snake to come. So obviously you can see they have tapped into a gradation of this lower vital range, which corresponds to the snake consciousness, which gives them the power over them, and this power to reverse the snake bite. Now, all of this would represent a higher kind of knowledge, because this is quite sophisticated, but applied on a lower level. Obviously, on a practical level, if you have a higher knowledge, what do? Let's say there is within an entire tribe one person who has a higher spiritual knowledge, even of occult things, and people come to him for sicknesses and other types. He cannot be teaching the higher spiritual knowledge. He can only be helping them, serving them for these mundane problems. My goat is lost. Please help me find it. And then he does what he does. At some point, he teaches others so that he can be free, or at some point, he transmits his knowledge, and you can see how it can debase very quickly to the level of the common mass and their needs and priorities. So this is one example of debased remnant. This is an example of a fall from a higher, or a vestige where certain practices associated with access to higher planes, which were done, for example, during certain astronomical alignments. When there is an alignment between worlds, you can access as if currents of the vital world. There's one significant current which takes place around this period, around 24th December or 21st December, when the sun shifts northward once again. So earlier, the days are becoming shorter, nights are becoming longer, and then there's the reversal, nights become shorter, days become longer. And in the vital planes, which have a close connection, especially the lower ranges of the vital, they have a close connection to the moon and the sun. There is actually a tide of energy, which is as if the increasing access to the darker forces, and then the reversal of that and the increasing access to light forces, which is experienced as if a clearing of the passage towards the higher realms. So with this reversal of the tide, it is literally a tide, just as if you want to launch a ship on the ocean, the tide is falling, you cannot launch. But when the tide starts rising, you can easily launch and the tide will carry you far. So something like that. If you want to access the higher realms, well, you wait for the tide to change, and then you can rise with the increasing light to the higher regions. And so this was one of the knowledge which was kept in the past. And what it did was, it gave great value to the passage after death. In many old traditions, you will see that after a person has passed away, they will gather the bones and keep them. I have mentioned this before, perhaps. I went to a site in Ireland, which was one of those closed caves in the hill. And going inside through a narrow passage, there was a cut in the rock where exactly on that day, 21st December, on the day of the solstice, the sunlight will come straight through and reach a particular cut in the cave. And there were 3 such cuts, but this was the main cut. And they said when somebody dies, the bones of the person would be kept there so that on the 21st December, the sun can reach in and take the person with him. This was the belief. If you think about what the belief is, it seems so ridiculous without this background. Why on 21st December the sun will reach in and take away the person? How silly. The sunbeam carries your soul and you're keeping your bones. What's the idea? And why that date? But if you recognize that there's this higher knowledge of the tides of the vital worlds, that's the time when you can catch the swing and rise and free yourself rapidly to the higher regions. In the Mahabharata, there's the famous incident of Bhishma, who can choose when he can die, but he's already so full of arrows, he's going to die anyway. He waits for the solstice and then leaves his body to catch that movement of the. This is increasing. You're as if going against the tide. You're struggling to find your way through that passage. Now, this is just to explain to you how a higher knowledge can remain in a lower form, and he uses this word as a vestige. The practice has remained with the loss of the higher knowledge. And of course, now this is not so relevant. We have not spoken about it here. The mother has created this passage which allows you at the time of death, if you're conscious and remember the divine, there's a passage and a being that it presides over. It takes you right through like a tunnel, and you don't have to pass through these intermediate levels and get lost. So we see how it can be a fall or a vestige or a relapse from a higher knowledge belonging to a previous cycle of civilization. And now relapse, I want to give a couple of examples. We see this in Egypt and in many places in South America with the pyramids. So in Egypt, already at a late stage, the knowledge of the secret chambers within the pyramids had been lost, or it was kept by a few and no more accessed by others. Which underground passages still exist, most of them have been blocked or covered up. But they were in use at an earlier cycle of civilization. Similarly, in South America, you'll find again the pyramids built with precise astronomical proportions and relations, but by who and for what is unknown. When the first Europeans went to South America, they asked them who built them, and the people there said, we don't know. It was there from our most ancient memories. It was always there. So they had already lost that. But what had happened in its place, the pyramids or some knowledge relating to the pyramids had been debased, and it had taken the form of human sacrifice in South Americas. We do not know of that in Egypt, but in Egypt it had other forms where they used to worship crocodiles and other lower animals which belong to the vital domain. But in the South Americas, human sacrifice was associated with the pyramids. Not that the pyramids were made with that intention. Rather, they were now used by a fallen civilization. Their own earlier origins may have had a deeper knowledge which was lost, and now it was reduced to something very crude and even perverse. And so he says, relapse from a higher knowledge belonging to a previous cycle. So much of what you see in the ancient world was remnants from this relapse of a higher knowledge. They had even certain terms of vocabulary, certain practices whose meaning had been forgotten, but they belonged to an earlier phase where actually the power of the intellect and even intuition and a lot of occultism was quite prevalent. Or, he says, the debased remnants of a dead or obsolete culture. And perhaps this is a good example of that also. The culture has died, certain elements remain. For example, in Egypt, mummification. In the earlier stages, when it was still a living spiritually influenced culture, a lot of occultism though, but the spiritual influence was strong, the mummification was done only of the great spiritual beings, equivalent to the Indian concept of samadhi, where the person has embodied a higher consciousness, so they were mummified to preserve that consciousness and a very tangible physical level so that it may still be available to others. And there was a very complex knowledge of how to preserve the body. They would even remove organs and so on so that the tissue would not putrefy. But the occult component of the knowledge was to lock a gradation of the physical vital consciousness to keep it fixed in matter even after the soul had left. So, literally, one had the sense of being in the presence of the person physically, even though the soul has gone. So, you can see here a very sophisticated occult knowledge. They knew how to trap that consciousness instead of allowing it to dissolve. And this does not come casually, it does not come from vital instincts, it comes from a high, sophisticated knowledge. That form of the knowledge survives, but the deeper domain of knowledge of which this was a specific component is gone. So only the form remains. And then the mummification continues, and after a point, it seems to have no purpose. Anybody who's died, who's of some royal lineage, is put away somewhere, maybe not with the same elaborate process, but preserved. And then you find entire underground passages full of mummies of cats. Oh, they were the sacred cats who looked after the king, or the sacred cats who were part of the temple, and hundreds, thousands of these mummified cats or other animals. And at some point, you wonder, a remnant of a dead or obsolete culture, it has lost its relevance at that point. So I read the sentence again. But this primitive stage, if it is indeed such, and not, in what we still see of it, a fall or a vestige, a relapse from a higher knowledge belonging to a previous cycle of civilization, or the debased remnants of a dead or obsolete culture, can have been only a beginning. So it was followed after whatever stages by the more advanced type of religion of which we have a record in the literature or surviving documents of the early civilized peoples. This type, composed of a polytheistic belief and worship and cosmology, a mythology, a complexus of ceremonies, practices, rituals, and ethical obligations, interwoven sometimes deeply into a societal system, was ordinarily a national or tribal religion, intimately expressive of the stage of evolution of thought and life reached by the community. And he explains how in the outer forms, maybe the deeper significance may be lost, but that would have been there still. So this sentence and again the list which he gives there, beliefs, worship, cosmology, mythology, etc., what each of these corresponds to and why it's important to recognize them, this we will see next Sunday when we meet. I think I must just verify this. So next Sunday is 5th. I will not be here. I'll be out of station. So we continue this on the 12th, which is a Sunday. But we can look back at what he has described so far and recognize certain key elements relevant to us individually and to our current collective. Because remember, he says it always represents the current collective stage of humanity. Where are we at as a whole of humanity? Perhaps it's not high enough, but as a pocket of humanity, of people seeking a higher spiritual ideal. And even then, these principles or these truths are there. And these tendencies are also there. And we will see them, as I've mentioned earlier, in certain forms. People turning the agarbatti or lighting a flame or doing a prayer can easily be compared to certain religious forms or practices. But what it is that infuses life, meaning, or experience, if that is spiritual, then the form has value. If it does not have the spiritual content, then the form is at best a crutch to help you focus attention to eventually get to some experience. But it's useful for us to introspect and see where we are and what are the natural forms in which we tend to express our own aspiration, or through which we find support for our aspiration in our daily life. We can meditate on this for half a minute.